Hello, this Samuel. Samuel, can you hear us? Can you please open your camera if you can hear us from the English channel? Thank you very much, Samuel. Thank you. Can you hear us very well? Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone. Can we settle down now? Good afternoon. We will now start with the list of speakers for this afternoon. And I would like to call on Winden Jangen Etlam. Winden Jangen Etlam. Are they here in the room?
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je m'appelle.
Thank you. I'm Isa Osum from the Indigenous Grants Program of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm speaking on behalf of the Windinjangan organization, a language which is disappearing together with a collective memory of knowledge and identity and a view of the world. Article 13 of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples to convey their language and their cultural system to future generations, and yet major challenges remain, particularly the lack of sustainable financing, limited access to education in Indigenous languages, and insufficient support for initiatives taken by the communities themselves. The Adlam and Pular Olful written language systems show that community-based initiatives play a key role in revitalizing languages, as well as the intergenerational transmission, education, adaptation of languages to IT. Thus, we recommend that UNESCO acknowledge the Indigenous written system as part of the tangible and intangible cultural identity heritage, and to make available funding and enable the transmission of future generations. We would ask states to fully incorporate Indigenous languages into the educational system, public services, and IT transformation policies, together with Indigenous peoples. To the expert mechanism, we would ask them to draw up practical guidelines to implement the language rights of Indigenous peoples and to follow progress made during the International Decade of the Indigenous Languages. Looking towards 2027, Indigenous peoples shouldn't just benefit from language policies. They should be the key drivers, protect their language and maintain their language. This means that their language would be preserved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now I would like to call on the Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus affirms that the survival of Indigenous languages is inseparable from the survival of our peoples, cultures, and sovereign identities. Language is not merely cultural expression, it is a fundamental human right and the vessel of ancestral wisdom, customary law, and collective dignity. In Asia, linguistic erosion is not a passive loss, but the direct result of shrinking democratic space and systemic rights violations. In 2023 alone, 321 documented cases, including land dispossession, criminalization, intimidation, and violence against women, illustrate how assimilation policies dismantle the very structures needed for language survival. In Malaysia, Indigenous organizations and their supporters are using digital storytelling, animation, and artificial intelligence to revitalize Indigenous languages. These technologies are not replacing Indigenous knowledge, they are helping to bring it to life for the next generation through children's stories, educational materials, and community-led digital content. Indigenous peoples are advancing data sovereignty through the Indigenous Navigator initiatives, enabling Indigenous community-generated evidence to challenge state data and narratives. The Asian Framework on Indigenous Knowledge and Data Sovereignty 2023 is a milestone, ensuring oral traditions and spiritual knowledge are protected under community-controlled protocols. We highlight successful initiatives such as Centers of Excellence in Village Governance in Malaysia and Thailand, and the documentation of customary laws in Indigenous languages. These initiatives prove that revitalization must be anchored in self-determination, territorial rights, and community-led education. We call on states and UN agencies to recognize and fund Indigenous learning centers and teachers, protect territorial rights as the foundation of linguistic survival, mandate Indigenous data sovereignty in monitoring, and adopt inclusive policies ensuring women, youth, and persons with disabilities lead this decade. Protecting our languages is protecting our future. We urge EMRIP to ensure this decade delivers structural change, not symbolism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now I would like to move on to the nature conservancy, the nature conservancy.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm speaking as an Indigenous woman from Brazil and a grantee from the United Nations Indigenous Program. I would like to give voice to the recommendations put forward by the National Group on the International Decade of Indigenous Languages in Brazil. Indigenous representatives from various regions of the country. Indigenous languages are a lot more than communication instruments. They contain ancestral knowledge, spirituality, collective memory, and our profound relationship with the land. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in Articles 13, 14, and 16, acknowledges the right of Indigenous peoples to revitalize, use, and transmit their languages to future generations. Similarly, ILO Convention 169 establishes an obligation for states to preserve and promote these languages. However, the loss of language continues to be a reality in Brazil and in various regions of the world, whereas Indigenous peoples continue almost alone to take on the responsibility of protecting this cultural heritage, or this heritage of mankind. That is why we recommend EMRIP to encourage states to strengthen financing mechanisms for national action plans of the decade, to set up funds for language revitalization, support initiatives spearheaded by Indigenous peoples, and guarantee our full and effective participation in all language policies. Protecting our languages means protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. I hope that this decade will be a time of specific commitments, appropriate financing, and transformative actions. Nothing about us without us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now I would like to call on Congress Populaire Coutumier Kanak. Are you in the room? Congress Populaire Coutumier Kanak.
Merci, bonjour.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Indigenous mother tongues are the heritage of our ancestors created many millennia ago. They began through the totemic mutations of human beings. The worship of ancestors and rituals cannot be taken from a mother tongue because they express our respective philosophies. Every word, as well as phonetics, provides a measure of the past, present, and future. Mother tongue, through words, the tone, gestures are specific when they are used during traditional custom baptisms, where the first names of grandparents, grandmothers, and grandfathers are taken during traditional weddings or during separation of the spirit from the body. The mother tongue remains key, holistic, and specific to every request that we make of branches, barks, minerals, and our totems, whether they be mammals or animals. Our country, New Caledonia, makes up 28 mother tongues, which are all different from each other. The practice of our customs, animist ancestral faith, passed down orally from generation to generation through our ancestors, have made the survival of our languages possible today. It is our duty now to preserve our mother tongues through practice of our ancestral cultures and customs. There are only a small number of languages that have been recognized, and we note that we are losing speakers as generations go by, because many parents, which is the case in my traditional country, speak French to their children. To overcome this gap, we would suggest that the 28 languages be subject to education in their own languages to be adapted to our ancestral living conditions, and thereby multiply the chances of preservation of these languages. Custom is my natural religion. It is my constitution and that of my people. It is my life and my society. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for the statement. Now I would like to call on Anishinaabe Aski Nation. Anishinaabe Aski Nation, are you in the
Thank you,
room?
Chair. The Anishinaabe Aski Nation welcomes this discussion as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages approaches its midterm review. Indigenous languages are not only expressions of Indigenous cultures, they are institutions of Indigenous governance. The decade's success will be measured by whether Indigenous languages are once again lived, spoken, and transmitted within our nations. Indigenous languages carry laws, treaty relationships, ceremonies, identity, and knowledge across generations. When a language is lost, a nation's capacity to govern itself is diminished. Our delegation comes from nations whose languages were targeted by Canada's policies of forced assimilation and language suppression. Today, we carry the responsibility of their resurgence, reminding us that revitalization of Indigenous languages is not only about preserving words, but fulfilling our responsibilities to future generations. We offer 4 recommendations. First, member states should develop our update on Indigenous languages, on language action plans in partnership with Indigenous peoples before the decade's midterm review in 2027. Second, establish sustained financing with measurable implementation target and public reporting. Third, ensure AI initiatives affecting Indigenous languages, including language technologies, data infrastructure, and related developments, are governed through FPIC, Indigenous data, sovereignty, and effective regulation. Fourth, the expert mechanism should continue advancing discussions on an international convention on Indigenous language rights to strengthen legal protection, accountability, and sustain international cooperation beyond the decade. Our responsibility is to ensure the next generation inherits living Indigenous languages, not only recorded ones. Miigwech.
Thank you very much for the statement. Now I would like to call on the European Union. I hope you're ready now.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your patience. Distinguished Chair, members of the expert mechanism, distinguished Indigenous peoples, the European Union reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the rights of Indigenous peoples as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and International Human Rights Law to revive financing and the full, effective, and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples. The EU recognizes that Indigenous languages are central to cultural identity, self-determination, and the transmission of Indigenous knowledge. We see opportunities for digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, to support language documentation, education, and revitalization, provided that they're developed with the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and respect their rights and data governance. We're seriously concerned about attempts by certain states to instrumentalize Indigenous peoples for pursuing geopolitical ambitions. The European Union continues to support Indigenous peoples through its human rights policies and partnerships and remains committed to promoting inclusive rights-based digital transformation. Distinguished members of the expert mechanism, what concrete actions should state prioritize to strengthen financing, accountability, and the responsible use of emerging technologies for Indigenous language revitalization? I thank you.
Thank you very much, European Union. Now I would like to call on Australia to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Australia recognises that safeguarding Indigenous peoples' languages is central to cultural identity and community well-being. We acknowledge that there is still much work required for the preservation, revitalisation and promotion of the critical status of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' language. Australia remains actively involved in the UNESCO International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022 to 2023, having represented the Asia-Pacific Group on Global Task Force for making a decade of action for Indigenous languages since its establishment. Australia's participation in the International Decade is guided by the principles of nothing for us without us, working in genuine partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, consistent with the principles of self-determination. The Australian government has established the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Languages Policy Partnership. The partnership brings together governments and First Nations representatives to work in genuine partnerships to accelerate progress towards closing the gap, Target 16, culture and language, including increasing the number and strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages being spoken. The Languages Policy Partnership enables genuine partnership and coordinated national approach to language revitalisation. In 2025, Australia committed funding for the International Decade activities over 3 years, including continuation of the International Decade Directions Group and support for global engagement and knowledge sharing with other First Nations. As a current UNESCO Executive Board member, Australia supports the International Decade of Indigenous Languages and efforts to ensure global cooperation and deliver tangible outcomes for the preservation and revitalisation of Indigenous languages. Australia welcomes opportunities with Indigenous peoples, member states and UN agencies to support ambitious, meaningful and lasting UN reform, which ensures a continuation of this important work to conserve and revitalise Indigenous peoples' languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Australia, for the statement. Now, I would like to call on Waipapa Tomata Rao, University of Auckland. Are you in the room, University of Auckland? All right, then in the meantime, I would like to call on Mexico to take the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman. We are grateful for this dialogue on the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. This is a decade which Mexico supports. In Mexico, we are undertaking many efforts to revitalize and strengthen Indigenous languages. Article 2 of our Constitution establishes the ability of the Indigenous peoples to use, preserve, protect, develop, and disseminate their Indigenous languages, and the obligation of governmental institutions to have interpreters and translators who are trained. That is why the Mexican government strengthens teaching, transmission, and preservation of 62 languages which belong to 58 Indigenous peoples in 22 federative states of the country. And this is through the establishment of 400 community houses and 400 language promoters who are operated and run by Indigenous peoples as subjects of public law. In addition, in 2023, the University of Indigenous Languages of Mexico was inaugurated. It aims to provide higher education to train professionals in Indigenous languages at the levels of BA, speciality, MA, and PhD. The university has BAs in the teaching of Indigenous languages, interpretation and translation into Indigenous languages, as well as intercultural Indigenous communication. Lastly, I am pleased to report that this year, Mexico has taken on the presidency of the Iberoamerican Institute of Indigenous Languages. The task is to promote the use, conservation, and development of Indigenous languages which are spoken in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mexico. Now, I would like to call on Norway to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. For a language to thrive, it must be actively used in everyday life. Today, this includes being seamlessly integrated into digital environments such as screens, platforms, and speech-based technologies. Younger generations, in particular, rely on digital platforms for communication. Therefore, to revitalize, preserve, and strengthen Indigenous peoples' languages, these languages must be fully functional and accessible in digital spaces. Digital literacy, skills, and lifelong access to digital learning should reflect the specific social, cultural, and linguistic contexts of each society. This is essential to ensure that people of all ages and backgrounds can use the internet meaningfully, securely, and safely, including Indigenous peoples. In our engagement in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, Norway has underlined that participation in the digital society is a democratic issue. Artificial intelligence is rapidly reshaping the technological landscape, creating both opportunities and challenges for Indigenous peoples' languages. We must act to ensure these languages are included in this development. Access to digital arenas is a prerequisite for exercising rights, participating in public life, and being heard on equal terms. We see that indigenous peoples' languages all over the world face many of the same challenges. Despite long-standing multilingual systems, indigenous peoples' languages still lack sufficient access. We urge major technology companies to strengthen their efforts in close cooperation with indigenous communities. Norway values collaboration through the UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages and other key forums, such as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norway, for the statement. Now I would like to call on the National Iwi Chairs Forum to take the floor.
Tēnā koe. The National Iwi Chairs Forum and Aotearoa Independent Monitoring Mechanism commend the expert mechanism for recognising that Indigenous language revitalisation is fundamental of Indigenous rights. Te reo Māori, the Māori language, is the living expression of whakapapa, genealogy, tikanga, customs, mātauranga, Māori knowledge, and rangatiratanga, sovereignty and self-determination. It carries our histories, values, identities, and responsibilities. Te reo Māori revitalisation is recognised as a leading example of Indigenous language regeneration. Our 2026 report, however, highlights the success of Māori-led learning institutions. Despite this and protections for te reo Māori within Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the UNDRIP, current government policy and legislative attacks seek to undermine its progress and status, demonstrating a total lack of constitutional regard for our human and Indigenous rights, including those related to our Indigenous language. Examples presented by IPOs in this session signify that states must be reminded of their obligations according to the principle of non-regression and those included in Articles 5, 13, 14, 18, and 19 of the UNDRIP. We respectfully recommend that the expert mechanism continue documenting Indigenous-led language revitalisation models, encourage states to develop long-term Indigenous language action plans in partnership with Indigenous peoples, promote greater support and investment in Indigenous-governed educational institutions, as well as families and communities as centres of language transmission, and recognise Indigenous languages as essential to self-determination, cultural continuity, and nation building. Ko te reo te Māori o te mana Māori. When Indigenous languages thrive, Indigenous peoples thrive. Tēnā koutou.
I thank you for your statement. Now I would like to call on Nama Cohen Network of Heritage Advocacy.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Nicodemus Cooper. The Namaquan Network of Heritage Advocacy welcomes this dialogue on International Decade of Indigenous People and commends UNESCO, EMRIP, and all partners working to preserve the world Indigenous peoples' languages. I speak on behalf of Nama people in Botswana, whose language, Namakoba, faces a critical risk of disappearing. More than a century ago, our community was forcibly displaced from our ancestral lands during the colonial genocide in the present-day Namibia. Today, only a few elders in Botswana remain fluent speakers and readers of our language. With every elder we lose an irreplaceable library of history, traditional knowledge, and cultural identity. We are, however, encouraged by the positive steps taken by the new government in promoting linguistic diversity from the introduction of Indigenous language, including some San languages on national broadcasting. We sincerely appreciate this commitment and hope that future phases will also include Namakoba, ensuring that all Indigenous communities are represented. Language revitalization should not stop at national borders. The Namakoba language is well established in neighboring Namibia, where it benefits from a documented language policy, educational materials, teacher training, and university-level instructions. This presents an important opportunity for regional cooperation. We respectfully encourage the government of Botswana to utilize its strong bilateral relations with Namibia to develop a joint language revitalization initiative. Such as cooperation could include the exchange of teachers and language experts, adaptation of existing curriculum and learning materials, cross-border community language camps, academic partnerships between universities, digital language resources, and support of documentation and teacher training. As we implement the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, we encourage states to view transboundary indigenous languages not as separate national issues, but as a shared regional heritage requiring collaborative action. Revitalization language.
I'm sorry, your time is exhausted. So I would like to call on the next speaker, that's Ukraine. Ukraine, please take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Since the temporary occupation of Crimea in 2014, indigenous peoples of Ukraine, particularly the Crimean Tatars, have faced systematic violations of their fundamental rights, including restrictions on language, education, culture, and identity. These actions represent a deliberate policy aimed at weakening indigenous peoples and accelerating assimilation. The Crimean Tatar language has been among the main targets of these efforts. Before the occupation, Crimea had 384 school classes providing education in the Crimean Tatar language, enabling thousands of children to learn in their native language and maintain their cultural heritage. Under the occupation administration of the Russian Federation, this system has been gradually dismantled, with opportunities for Crimean Tatar education reduced to a minimum and Russian becoming dominant in schools and public life. The occupying authorities have replaced Ukrainian educational standards with the Russian curriculum, removed Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar perspectives from textbooks, and introduced ideological programs promoting loyalty to the occupying state. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, similar practices have expanded to other parts of temporarily occupied territory, where Ukrainian language education has been nearly eliminated and children are forced to study according to Russian programs without access to their native language or independent historical narratives. These policies violate international obligations, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which guarantees indigenous peoples' rights to preserve, develop, and transmit their language and cultural traditions. They also undermine the objectives of the International Decade of Indigenous Language established by the UN to protect endangered languages worldwide. UNESCO estimates that around 40% of the world's approximately 7,000 languages are at risk of disappearing, highlighting the urgent need for action. The experience of the Crimean Tatars demonstrates how occupation and repression can threaten linguistic diversity. The International Decade should serve as a platform for stronger monitoring, support for language revitalization, documentation of violations, and accountability. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ukraine. Now I would like to call on the Indian Confederation of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Northeast Zone, a joint statement with Bodo National Students Union.
Kolombai Gedema Chair, distinguished Chair, members of EMRIP, their indigenous sisters and brothers. I speak today on behalf of Bodo indigenous people from Assam, India, to draw urgent attention to the situation of Bodo language within the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Bodo is an indigenous Tibeto-Burman language of the Bodo people of Northeast India, North Bengal, and Mechi Anchal of Nepal, carrying oral histories, spiritual worldviews, and ecological knowledge that have been transmitted across generations. Yet, like many other indigenous languages of India and worldwide, Bodo, despite one of the recognized and listed in the 8 scheduled languages of India, continue to face pressures and challenges from dominant state languages in education, administration, media, leading to intergenerational language shift and loss of cultural identity. We welcome the International Decade of Indigenous Languages and EMRIP's leadership in linking language with the broader rights of indigenous peoples, including self-determination and participation in decision-making. In this spirit, we call on India and relevant UN bodies to ensure mother tongue-based, culturally appropriate multilingual education in Bodo language and ensure to use Bodo in public administration and services in Bodo territories, and support community-led initiatives for documentation, revitalization, and digital adaptation of the language, including through fair access to digital platforms and emerging technologies such as AI. For Bodo and other indigenous languages to thrive, they must be alive in homes, schools, community institutions, and on our screens. We urge EMRIP, UNESCO, and states to work.
Thank you very much. You have exhausted your time. So now I would like to call on the Wind Sports International to take the floor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Through you, we call for the Human Rights Council to support the establishment of a legally binding international convention on Indigenous peoples' languages as an outcome of the International Decade for Indigenous Languages. We urge all 4 UN mechanisms, the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly together to cooperate in creating a high-level event at the upcoming decade midpoint to serve as the launch of the establishment of this convention. We propose for consideration the expert mechanism within your mandate and in consultation with the other mechanisms, the Moscow Convention as a template for the development of a legally binding convention. As a good practice, the Samson Cree Nation has advanced this item, noting 2 recent initiatives. First, the Nipsikopa Kawasisak Samson Cree Nation Children's Declaration, which mandates the central inclusion of the UN Declaration Article 22, amongst others, in the development, implementation, and enforcement of all Samson Nations policies, programs, services, and laws. Secondly, and finally, the UN Declaration and its complete translation and interpretation into Nehiawewin, our sacred and inherent Cree language. Nehiawewin is declared by law as an official language of the Musqueam Cree. Together, these will strengthen, protect, enforce, and action all rights, including Indigenous children's language rights. Thank you. Hai hai.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now, I would like to call on the Africa Indigenous Foundation for Energy and Sustainable Development to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Language forms one of the greatest expressions of our cultural identities. Our language is connected with our spirituality, with our environment, and with our social well-being. The loss of any language signals not only the loss of a civilization, it is a final funeral rite for the loss of a people. Last year, Mr. Chair, the Nigerian government abolished the teaching of mother tongue in primary schools. And of course, you know the impact of that on our next generation. It is a recognition of this that we are calling on EMRIP to urge the Nigerian government to return the teaching of mother tongue in primary schools in the country. Secondly, we call on the establishment of a fund for the decade that will be accessed by indigenous people and others to carry out activities aimed at preserving, revitalizing, and promoting their language. We call on UNESCO as the lead agency for the decade to carry out the national mapping of indigenous languages and ensure that nations commit resources to the development of such language. We also call on the integration of FPIC in the development of artificial intelligence policies in relation to the use and translation of indigenous languages. And lastly, of course, Mr. Chair, you know the important role that land plays in language conservation and the language revitalization. We urge the dismantling of the obnoxious colonial land use laws that are in all our countries, and in this place, we put indigenous laws that promote our land use and, of course, our land protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now I call on La Voix de la Femme Amazighe. Is that understandable?
Hello. Yes. Distinguished members of the expert mechanisms, distinguished representatives of indigenous peoples. My name is Karima Skunti, and I'm speaking on behalf of La Voix de la Femme Amazigh, an indigenous non-governmental organization working to promote and defend the rights of Amazigh women. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we must reaffirm that the value of this declaration lies not only in its recognition, but in its effective implementation. For Indigenous women, the gap between international commitments and daily realities remains a major concern. Amazigh women in Morocco have historically played a fundamental role in preserving our language, identity, cultural heritage, and traditional knowledge. However, many continue to face multiple forms of discrimination that affect their ability to fully enjoy their rights. In our communities, women still encounter barriers in accessing essential public services, including healthcare, education, justice, and administrative services. Language barriers, geographical isolation, and insufficient consideration of Indigenous realities can prevent them from exercising rights that should be guaranteed to all. The Declaration recognizes through Articles 2, 18, 21, 22, and 23 the principles of non-discrimination, participation, equality, and the rights of Indigenous peoples to be involved in decisions affecting them. We therefore encourage states, United Nations human rights mechanisms, and relevant institutions to strengthen the implementation of the Declaration by ensuring the meaningful participation of Indigenous women and youth, guaranteeing culturally appropriate public services, and supporting Indigenous organizations working at the community level. The Declaration is a powerful instrument, but its true impact will be measured by the changes it creates in the daily lives of Indigenous peoples. For Indigenous women, recognizing their rights means ensuring that they can live with dignity, equality, and full participation. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now I would like to call on Venezuela to take the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. Chair, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela thanks the experts for organizing a meeting on this agenda item. For our country, the protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples is a commitment to the memory and cosmovision of our people. 42 Indigenous languages are spoken in our country, a live expression of the culture and the multi-ethnic pluricultural nature of our country. Mr. Chairman, the promotion of these languages is an express mandate contained in our constitutions. In 2021, Venezuela started a comprehensive review of the law on indigenous languages in order to revitalize, protect these languages and transmit them to future delegations. Also, the country is promoting community spaces where the elderly transmit their languages to children through oral narration, dialogue, and songs. In this way, not only the languages are preserved, but also traditional knowledge, values, and traditions of each people's. Nevertheless, we have to say the UCMs create obstacles for states to implement and protect the economic, social, and cultural rights of Indigenous peoples and the necessary resources to implement public policies. These measures also compromise the promotion of Indigenous language and traditional knowledge. Venezuela will continue to work together with Indigenous peoples to revitalize and preserve their languages, convinced that to preserve a language is to preserve the memory and identity of peoples. We also demand the immediate lifting of UCMs that create obstacles to the enjoyment of human rights and to implement the objectives of this decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venezuela. Now I would like to call on Organización Maya Wayop Cambio. You in the hall? Organización Maya Wayop Cambio. Okay, all right, then I would like to call on Ontario Native Women's Association to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I'll begin in my language and then continue in English. Wasi kwe menajisa gabo indishnakas, mong nidodam, kiash saging inishnabek nidonjiba. Our languages are our laws, our teachings, our relationship with the land, and our identity. Our languages are fundamental to our self-determination, our sovereignty, and our livelihood. For Indigenous women and girls, Language is rooted in who we are. It carries the teachings of our elders, our responsibilities to future generations, and our role in our communities. Colonial policies have deliberately sought to erase our languages, particularly by forced removal of our children from homes and communities. While we recognize that Canada launched a national action plan for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages in June 2024, we are deeply concerned about the lack of action and funding, including the vast disproportionate funding allocated to the official colonial languages, English and French, compared to the Indigenous languages. We recommend EMRIP to include in your report to the Human Rights Council the need to first urge the states to adequately finance measures to implement the Global Action Plan and domestic action plans on Indigenous languages. This includes adequately funding Indigenous women's organizations to maintain and provide access to traditional languages, cultures, Indigenous knowledge, and land-based knowledge and healing. Second, ensure Indigenous women's full, effective, and meaningful participation, as well as leadership at all levels of decision-making. And third, implement the expert mechanisms, previous proposals, to advance the Global Action Plan on Indigenous languages and to include an Indigenous gender-based lens that adequately includes Indigenous women. Chimigwich, many thanks.
Thank you very much. Now we will go to the last two speakers for this afternoon for this topic. So I call on Unit Circumpolar Council to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I speak on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council as we mark the midpoint of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, approaching in 2027. Sorry, I just ran. For us in Galatli Nunat, Greenland, our language Galatlisut Greenlandic is not only a way to communicate, it's tied to our culture, our identity, and our way of life. Galatlisut belongs to the wider Inuit language family, stretching from Alaska through Canada to Greenland. Our task is not only to preserve this language, but to keep it alive and active in education, administration, media, technology, and public services. Strengthening language is not only about teaching and international recognition. We also need concrete language infrastructure, dictionaries, research, documentation of dialects, language, technology, funding, and clearer responsibility of the language field. Language technology can support this work. The Language Secretariat in Galatli Nunat, Greenland, has been given a responsibility for a project on AI-based legal aid, including translation, speech-to-text, and text-to-speech. This shows AI can be useful for Galatlisut. But we must remember that AI should be used critically and carefully. One weakness of AI and machine translation is that it does not always understand the cultural context behind our languages. It also does not always know which words or expressions are correct or suitable in a given situation. It can therefore be risky to use AI without critical checking, especially in public services. I reiterate, strengthening Indigenous peoples' languages requires real infrastructure, dictionaries research, dialect documentation, technology, and clear responsibility. We urge states and UNESCO to act accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. Now, as the last speaker for this item, I would like to call on the University of Colorado American Indian Law Program. Please take the floor. Are they not in the room? All right, then may I call on the Sami Parliament in Norway?
Chair, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages is a global call for action proclaimed by the UN to address the critical loss of Indigenous peoples' languages and to mobilize stakeholders to revitalize and uplift Indigenous peoples' languages. The decade is an opportunity to ensure that our languages are preserved, revitalized, and passed on to future generations in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. When the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution on rights of indigenous peoples proclaiming the period of 2022 to 32, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, based on a recommendation by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we must understand the decade in the context of the adoption of the resolution, a resolution named the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Therefore, I must address a concerning trend that the term indigenous languages has been interpreted to include more than only indigenous peoples' languages. The use of the term in ways that do not in line with the UNDRIP contributes to violation of indigenous peoples' human rights and creates serious challenges for our ability to represent ourselves. This is a serious concern which has been addressed by the Permanent Forum, EMRIP, and the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the outcome document of February 26-28, 2024. We urge EMRIP to advise relevant UN entities to uphold the same clarity. The need to protect the status of indigenous peoples is not about weakening the interest of other groups, but about safeguarding the distinct history and rights of indigenous peoples. Ologito. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the number of speakers list for this agenda item. Now I would like to invite the representative of International Decade of Indigenous Languages Secretariat UNESCO to take the floor and deliver your statement. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Excellencies, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. As this session dedicated to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages comes to a close, I am pleased to take the floor on behalf of Mr. Guillermo Canella, Director of the Division for Digital Inclusion and Head of the Secretariat of the International Decade, whom many of you met in last year's session. Due to a conflicted agenda, he regrettably cannot join us for this session and kindly asked me to convey this message on his behalf. I would like to thank the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples for providing this important space for dialogue, and all of you for sharing your perspectives and recommendations with us today. Over the past 4 years, we have had the privilege to work alongside indigenous peoples, member states, academic institutions, civil society organizations, and countless other partners dedicated to safeguarding, revitalizing, and promoting indigenous languages. This journey has been and continues to be one of continuous learning. As mentioned by the representative of the Global Task Force, Mr. Annabel Benjamin Barra, we are approaching the midpoint of the decade, coinciding next year with the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This will be an important moment to take stock of progress and consider the work that remains ahead. We are grateful for the perspectives shared today, which will help us guide this reflection. We take this opportunity to call for member states and partners to strengthen their financial support to the decade. Without sustained resources matched to the scale of our ambitions, many initiatives led by indigenous peoples risk remaining underfunded and unable to reach their full potential. Since the launch of the decade, we have seen growing awareness, stronger partnerships, and inspiring initiatives led by indigenous peoples and communities across the world, many of which we have heard about today. At the same time, we are very conscious that many challenges remain. In too many places, indigenous languages continue to face significant pressures, and commitments have not always translated into concrete action or adequate support. The discussions we have heard today reaffirm several priorities that UNESCO, as the Secretariat of the Decade, remains committed to advancing alongside our partners. We will continue promoting holistic approaches that recognize that languages cannot be separated from culture, knowledge system, territories, and ways of life. We will continue supporting member states in the development and implementation of national action plans in partnership with indigenous peoples, because sustainable progress requires both political commitment and community leadership. We will continue to promote more robust international collaboration and to push for more sustained funding. We will continue to place women and young people at the center of the decade. And we will continue, of course, working to ensure that the impact of this decade extends well beyond 2032. As it was mentioned by Mr. Bara, as well as many of you today, indigenous languages are being challenged by the rapid advance of digital technologies and artificial intelligence, which brings both promise and risk. UNESCO is actively engaged on this front, working to promote indigenous-led data governance, grounded in the rights affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, including self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, and full participation in decision-making. Indigenous peoples must be partners from the outset in decisions about how the languages, knowledge, and data are used and protected in digital systems. Before handing the floor back to you, Mr. Chair, I warmly invite you to stay engaged beyond today's session through UNESCO dedicated website and social media channels for the decade, or by writing to our secretariat. And if you are here with us today, please do come speak with me afterward, and I'd be glad to listen and bring your perspectives back to Paris. Thank you once again to all of you for your engagement and for the work that each of you is doing to ensure that indigenous languages continue to live, to grow, and thrive. I thank you.
Thank you very much, UNESCO, on your statement regarding the very important work that you are doing. Now, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bara, representative of the Global Task Force, for his closing remarks, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Esteemed members of EMRIP, distinguished delegates, and my dear brothers and sisters, I agree that indigenous peoples' languages cannot be preserved only on documents. Indigenous people languages need conducive environment for its protection, promotion, and preservation. And for this, we need resources. Lack of resources could lead to protection crisis. As we conclude this discussion on the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all those who shared their experiences, concerns, priorities, and recommendations today. The intervention we have heard reaffirm a message that lies at the heart of the decade of indigenous languages and are inseparable from indigenous peoples' identities, knowledge, systems, cultures, and rights. I assure you that the reflection shared during this session will not remain within these walls. I will bring them back to the Global Task Force of the decade so that they can inform our discussions, guide our priorities, and support follow-up action in the years ahead. As we approach both the midpoint of the decade and the 20th anniversary of the UNDRIP, we have an opportunity to renew our commitment and accelerate our efforts. Above all, we must ensure that indigenous peoples continue to lead the decade. Indigenous peoples are not only beneficiaries of this work, they are its authors, leaders, and driving force. The future of indigenous languages must be shaped by the peoples and communities who speak, sign, teach, and transmit them. Therefore, as the member of the Global Task Force for IDIL, I would like to propose to have the Convention of Indigenous Peoples' Languages. And for this, we need your support and cooperation, my dear brothers and sisters. I would like to call all member states, United Nations agencies, and private sector partners to strengthen their financial commitment to the decade. The ambitions we have set out can only be realized with sustained support and resources. We therefore invite all the stakeholders to contribute so that our shared commitments lead to lasting outcomes for indigenous languages and the communities who speak or sign them. Johar, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bara. We are almost out of time, but I would like to check with my fellow EMRIP members if you have any quick comments. Yes, Cheryl, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As time did not permit members to comment at the close of our last discussion, I will, with your indulgence, offer a couple of combined reflections on the 20 years and languages. I do think they're connected. We heard concrete progress across multiple regions: Mexico, Finland, Burundi, Aotearoa, New Zealand, many, many more. And the floors reminded us that where languages are recovering, it's because Indigenous peoples themselves are doing that work. And we also heard something less tangible, but I think is equally important, and that is that the Declaration has become the shared reference point, the common language through which Indigenous peoples, states, and UN bodies now conduct this dialogue. That was simply not true 20 years ago. And it's a significant achievement that belongs above all to the Indigenous negotiators and elders who brought this instrument into being, and whose original purpose, as Chief Littlechild reminded us in the previous session, we must never forget. At the same time, this morning's discussion and this afternoon's discussion were very clear-eyed. What will stay with me is that 20 years of endorsement does not mean 20 years of implementation, and the same holds for languages. We are at the midpoint of the international decade, and the pace of language loss still outruns the pace of institutional response. Revitalization too often depends on the unpaid labor of people in communities rather than sustained and adequate public financing. Across the broader implementation picture, we heard a consistent pattern. Free, prior, and informed consent reduced in practice to consultation, or exercised in processes where outcomes are already determined. We heard about non-recognition of peoples operating as a threshold that forecloses every other right that follows, and a development we must name plainly and clearly: the criminalization of Indigenous leaders and defenders, the increasing level of violence against Indigenous women, despite numerous inquiries and legislation, and the serious pressures of conflict and climate change are falling first and hardest on Indigenous peoples in all regions. Looking towards 2027 and the decade beyond, I take away three directions. First, the anniversary must be an accountability moment, not a ceremonial one. And proposals we've heard for national action plans and a plan of action on implementation all deserve serious consideration. The proposal to begin work on a UN Convention on Indigenous Languages speaks to exactly this: moving language rights from aspiration to obligation, with the second half of the decade as our runway. Second, implementation advances where Indigenous peoples hold institutional standing, parliaments, treaty bodies, iwi structures, and building that participation architecture, including here at the United Nations, should be a priority. And third, the next 20 years will raise questions the first 20 could not have even imagined: data sovereignty, Indigenous-led research, cross-border mobility issues, the impacts of war, and of course, ever-present climate change. We have much, much collective work ahead of us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. It's time to now close the session. I just only would like to say that if we truly recognize the importance of this topic, then I think we will also understand what an Indigenous elder said in this session on the first day. Something like, if I give you my words, I'm giving you my soul, because language expresses the very essence of being a human. So if we lose our language, we lose our identity. I hope that you have enjoyed this session as much as I did. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. We will now proceed with item 11, future work of the expert mechanism. And on behalf of EMRIP, Indigenous peoples, representatives, member states, NGOs, and others, I welcome you all to item 11. It's my pleasure to chair this session on the future work of the expert mechanism, where we will hope to hear your suggestions for future thematic studies and reports. Before opening the floor, I am pleased to share with you an overview of our work going forward and welcome your contributions. In accordance with our standard practice and pursuant to our mandate under Human Rights Council Resolution 33/25, we as EMRIP determine the theme of our studies and report 1 year in advance to allow sufficient time for preparation. Consequently, during our intersessional meeting held last year, we decided that our thematic study for 2027 will be on business and the rights of Indigenous peoples, with a view toward examining business practices and evolving human rights challenges. This topic was chosen based on the expressed requests by Indigenous peoples during recent year sessions. Later in the year, we intend to conduct a seminar in collaboration with an academic institution and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the purpose of gathering insights that will inform our study. Additionally, this is extremely important, we'll open a call for inputs to gather further contributions and up-to-date information from all stakeholders. We highly value your active participation, and it is absolutely essential to enrich the study, both with information and Indigenous peoples' perspectives and lived experiences. The expert mechanism will also prepare a report next year for the Human Rights Council on good practices and lessons learned regarding the efforts to achieve the ends of the declaration, as authorized under Council Resolution 33/25, paragraph 2B. This report will be a stock-taking report on the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. EMRIP looks forward to your feedback on our next study, and we welcome your suggestions now for our subsequent study for beyond 2027 and future work, including potential study themes for coming years and intersessional activities. I will now open the floor for the speakers list. I would first like to offer the floor to the Continental Alliance of Traditional and Indigenous Midwives of the Americas.
Somos la Alianza Continental.
We are the Continental Alliance of part of the traditions in the Americas, made up of women who are midwives. Given the continuity of life and ancestral knowledge in our land, we would like to say that the Indigenous midwifery isn't part of the Western one. It is a comprehensive healthcare of Indigenous peoples. It is a living expression of the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination as regards our relationship with our cultures, land, and languages, and the continuity of our peoples. Despite our fundamental role, midwifery, Indigenous midwifery continues to be invisible in international human rights processes and world health. Indigenous midwives continue to face systemic discrimination because our systems, our knowledge systems are excluded. The practices, knowledge, and traditional practices are not recognized. When it comes to the future work of the expert mechanism, we would like to say that EMRIP has not yet conducted a specific study on Indigenous midwifery. which has left a significant gap in its work. That is why we would recommend EMRIP in its future program to include a global study on midwifery and Indigenous women, looking at this as a differentiated Indigenous health system which is comprehensive and as an exercise of the rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, including the rights to self-determination, health, culture, and traditional knowledge. We also recommend that the study be carried out in direct collaboration with Indigenous midwives, including my own alliance. This study would make it possible to overcome gaps.
Time has elapsed. I'd next like to offer the floor to Indigenous World Association.
Yesterday, we intervened under item 5 to highlight the serious threats of plastic pollution to Indigenous peoples worldwide. As identified by the former Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, different stages of the plastic life cycle are violating our rights under UNDRIP, including, quote, serious violations of Indigenous peoples' rights to health, culture, water, food, healthy environment, self-determination, among others, end quote. While we bear witness to the harmful shifts in multilateralism and movements away from good faith negotiations and UN mechanisms, Indigenous peoples are also being left out of important meetings and decisions. However, we still persevere in these international spaces because the decisions made here affect our rights and our very survival. We urge EMRIP to consider for your future work a study and panel examining the rights implications of plastic pollution for Indigenous peoples across the plastic life cycle, from extraction to waste, and call for the full application of UNDRIP and FPIC in the finalization and implementation of the Future Plastics Treaty. The situation is urgent. Indigenous peoples and our territories are being treated as sacrifice zones. From oil spills in our lands and waters to microplastics in our traditional foods and our babies. We are on the front lines of the plastic pollution crisis, but we are not passive victims. We are experts, knowledge holders, and rights holders, and we must be equal participants in all decision-making about this global problem. EMRIP and other UN mechanisms for Indigenous peoples can play a vital role in supporting this work to safeguard our rights, ensure our meaningful participation, and influence stronger outcomes. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that statement. And next is a joint statement from Inuit Circumpolar Council, Sami Council, Sami Parliament of Norway, Sami Parliament of Finland.
Thank you, Chair. I deliver this joint intervention on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Sami Council, and the Sami Parliaments in Norway and Finland. As we look ahead to the future work of the expert mechanism, we would like to raise one concrete proposal. The expert mechanism study on the right of Indigenous peoples to data was an important piece of work. It affirmed that data sovereignty is a natural extension of the right to self-determination, but the landscape is changing fast. AI systems now depend on large-scale data collection. Much of it is drawn from open sources, often without our knowledge or consent. This raises questions and challenges the previous study could not have seen coming. Furthermore, the massive infrastructure of data centers and the mining of critical minerals required for AI hardware put immense pressure on Arctic lands and Indigenous peoples' territory globally. We therefore propose the expert mechanism consider undertaking a new formal study on artificial intelligence and the rights of Indigenous peoples, building upon your previous work on data sovereignty. Such a study would examine how our data is collected, used, and governed across the AI lifecycle. The systemic risk of algorithmic bias and misrepresentation of AI-generated outputs, the physical and environmental impacts of AI-related resource extraction and energy infrastructure on Indigenous peoples' territories. It could offer guidance grounded in free, prior, and informed consent, and how to best support Indigenous peoples-led institutions and expert-building expertise in this space. We believe the expert mechanism is well placed to build on its own foundation and to help ensure that technological development in this age of AI becomes a tool for empowerment, not further marginalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the joint statement. I'd next like to offer the floor to Guatemala.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Guatemala restates its commitment to the recognition, respect, and guarantee of the rights of Indigenous peoples, and this fully in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights on Indigenous Peoples. Aware of the ongoing challenges, the country has fostered and made significant headway in strengthening legal pluralism. An example of this is the policy from the judicial body on access to justice for Indigenous peoples, which promotes harmonious coordination between the national legal system and Indigenous legal systems. Similarly, protocols and policies have been implemented which are culturally and linguistically relevant in justice institutions such as the Institute for Criminal Public Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, seeking to guarantee effective and differentiated access to justice. Furthermore, bodies have been bolstered, such as the Ombudspersons for Indigenous Women and the Presidential Commission Against Discrimination and Racism. They have been given greater competencies to prevent and report acts of discrimination and racism. However, there are challenges that still remain for greater coverage of public institutions, which consolidate effective coordination mechanisms between Indigenous authorities and state institutions, in particular when it comes to justice and community security. This process is vital to ensure the protection of the collective rights and strengthen trust in public institutions. Against that backdrop, Guatemala would like to make the following recommendation to the expert mechanism. We would suggest that an analysis of coordination models be carried out between the legal systems of Indigenous peoples and state systems. It's important to identify good practices and common challenges. This comparative analysis could be a guide for states to continue to work on the recognition of Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that statement. I'd next like to offer the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Australia thanks EMRIP for its continued leadership in advancing the implementation of the UNDRIP. We recognise the mechanism's unique role in providing practical advice to member states and fostering constructive dialogue with Indigenous peoples. EMRIP's focus on actionable advice that assists states and Indigenous peoples to implement UNDRIP at the national level remains vital. EMRIP provides a platform for exchanging successful approaches, including legislative reforms, co-design processes, and consultation models, which supports learning across regions. In EMRIP's work going forward, Australia encourages greater attention to the specific challenges facing Indigenous peoples in our region of the Pacific, who are on the front line of climate impacts. The effects of climate change are real and immediate for Indigenous peoples. COP31 will be an opportunity to share Indigenous peoples' knowledge and opportunities for Indigenous peoples on the global stage. Australia is working with Turkey to deliver COP31 and with Pacific Island countries to deliver pre-COP and elevate Pacific priorities. Fiji will host the pre-COP meeting with a special leaders event in Tuvalu in October. Our partnerships demonstrate our commitment to strengthening global action on climate change for all, including Indigenous peoples. Australia also encourages EMRIP to remain responsive to emerging and evolving issues, including the implications of new technologies such as artificial intelligence and their impact on Indigenous languages, data governance and sovereignty, and cultural heritage. As the 20th anniversary of UNDRIP approaches, we encourage EMRIP to remain solutions-focused, bridging the gap between international standards and real improvements in the lives, rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for your statement, Australia. I'd next like to offer the floor to Ulithi Falalop Community Action Program. Not in the room. Next, I'd like to offer the floor to Native American Church.
Yate, greetings, Chair and tribal nations. Thank you for calling on the Native American Church, State of New Mexico. Our mission is to support the protection of American Indian religious, ceremonial, spiritual, and traditional practices, and is comprised of tribal citizens, including individuals of the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation in the United States of America has over 405,000 citizens who primarily live in around established reservations. The Navajo Nation and its citizens have revered relationships with its reservation land that the U.S. currently recognizes as the nation's land, as well as lands associated that are outside the boundaries of the reservation. Under Article 25 of the Declaration, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Indigenous peoples in the United States and across the globe bring forth issues and solutions to the expert mechanism. For the Navajo people and other indigenous peoples in the United States, implementation of articles of the Declaration is extremely important. At this time, however, we call for a focus on our self-determination with respect to lands that are traditionally owned or occupied otherwise. We ask EMRIP to devote a future study or report on the question of the implementation of the Declaration in the context of 3 areas. 1, protection of traditional plant knowledge and traditional ceremonial practices. 2nd, indigenous-led conservation efforts for the protection and preservation of the natural habitat of medicinal plants. And 3rd, the need for consultation with a view to obtain FPIC, state actions that affect access to protection of traditional medicine plants, including derivatives and their natural habitats. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that statement. I'd next like to offer the floor to Botanical Society of South Africa. Okay, next speaker, Leningrad Regional Public Organization, Vepsian Community.
Здравствуйте. Уважаемая госпожа председатель, я выступаю от имени Организации коренных народов Вепская община Северо-Запада России. Я грантополучатель Фонда добровольных взносов ООН для коренных народов. И я благодарю фонд за возможность принять участие в работе экспертного механизма.
Participate in the work of the mechanism in order to carry out an objective assessment and in order to have universal recommendations made by the UN. The priorities of indigenous people should be taken into account. I'd like to draw your attention to the collective study of indigenous peoples on implementing the Rio de Janeiro trends. The legal concept of indigenous peoples in Russia does not simply recognize indigenous peoples, but ensures actual access to land and biological resources for traditional land use, preserving the culture and identity of indigenous peoples. At the same time, what is also necessary is to improve legal mechanisms for the practical implementation of certain rights, especially in the area of fishing and hunting, especially in specially protected natural territories. This is why indigenous peoples have developed and presented their proposals into the National Strategy on Biodiversity. Our proposals have been taken into account and are part of this new national strategy. We do hope that these provisions will be preserved in the document when it will be adopted by the government. We invite EMRIP to carry out a study on the realization of the rights of indigenous peoples as part of environmental processes, paying special attention to the Convention on Biodiversity and other international environmental agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the statement. And I'd next like to offer the floor to Russian Federation.
Thank you, distinguished Madam Chair, distinguished members of EMRIP. We would like to first and foremost remind you a key word used by the Special Rapporteur in his statement yesterday, as far as I remember. The word was stagnation. And as the Russian delegation believes, this word applies to the work of UN special institutions on the rights of indigenous peoples. We're still at a point of stagnations in terms of adopting the rules of procedure for EMRIP in order to avoid a situation where, for example, this morning's meeting started without a quorum and continued in that form for 30 minutes. And it started when only 2 members of EMRIP participated in the meeting. So the question arises, with whom are we carrying out this dialogue? Another issue, why do we need these rules of procedures? To regulate the participation of indigenous peoples. We have to avoid situations when the same people during the sessions speak on behalf of 5, 6 organizations, and the origin of these organizations or where they come from, we're not really aware of. Another point, we have to resume normal diplomatic exchanges. For example, for a month, the Russian Federation mission in Geneva has been waiting for a response from EMRIP, who is the author of the study on post-conflict situations related to indigenous peoples, and how can paragraphs 47 and paragraph 58 be placed in the report that include disinformation about the situation in Russia. For example, referring to so-called Inuit territories in Russia. Such territories do not exist in Russia. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for your statement. I'd next like to offer the floor to Global Disability Caucus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I speak on behalf of the National Indigenous Disabled Women Association Nepal, Asia Pacific Indigenous Women with Disabilities Network, and Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Network. We are 58 million indigenous persons with disabilities, and the data shows that the prevalence rate of being disability is 2 to 3 times higher among indigenous peoples. And this number is alarmingly growing day by day. Under the mandates of the UN Permanent Forum in 2013 and under the mandates of the Special Rapporteur in 2025, only 2 studies have been conducted till to date. And there is a lot of emerging issues like disasters, climate crisis, isolations, mental trauma that is interconnected being disabled among our peoples. In Nepal and across Asia, 92% indigenous women and girls with disabilities face harassment, assault, violence, abuse, and forced sterilization, both in private and public sphere, due to indigeneity, disability, and sexuality, and our lives experience are distinct. And this is why our issues need to be put into the priority. So we recommend the EMRIP members to conduct a study on indigenous persons and women with disabilities aligned with the CEDAW Convention, CEDAW General Recommendation 39. The enhanced participation must enhance indigenous persons with disabilities and determine our own representative to speak for ourselves, not by others. We should be an integral part of the discussion, influencing the decisions that affect our life, and participate safely without state interference. Indigenous persons with disabilities must be recognized not merely as beneficiaries, but as right holders and knowledge holders and equal partners in shaping an inclusive, equitable, sustainable future for peoples and planet. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for that statement. Next, I'd like to offer the floor to Minority Rights Group.
Thank you, Chairperson, members of the expert mechanism, distinguished delegates and Indigenous representatives. I deliver this message on behalf of a group of Indigenous midwives who are not able to be present in Geneva today. In its 2016 study on the right to health in Indigenous peoples, EMRIP recognized that Indigenous women face many barriers to the realization of their sexual and reproductive health and rights, linked to exclusion from reproductive health services and to disproportionately high rates of maternal mortality. For millennia, Indigenous midwives have safeguarded the health and well-being of Indigenous women, babies, families, and communities. Indigenous knowledge systems relating to pregnancy, childbirth, parenting, sexuality, and reproductive health are foundational to the cultural continuity, identity, and survival of Indigenous peoples. These knowledge systems are living expressions of self-determination and of responsibilities to future generations. A recent decision of the International Confederation of Midwives to suspend a statement on Indigenous midwifery taken at its recent Congress in Portugal is concerning. Such actions contribute to the ongoing erasure of Indigenous knowledge, expertise, and leadership within global maternal and reproductive health systems. We are equally concerned by the continued reluctance of some United Nations agencies and international institutions to explicitly recognize and support the role and contribution of Indigenous midwifery to the fulfillment of Indigenous women's sexual and reproductive rights. We therefore call upon EMRIP to follow up on its 2016 study and to intervene within the United system to get WHO and other relevant agencies to formally recognize Indigenous midwifery as a protected knowledge system. We urge EMRIP to champion this issue and ensure that Indigenous midwives are recognized, protected, and empowered as custodians of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement and perfectly timed to the second. Thank you. I'd next like to offer the floor to International Institute for Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Policy.
Hinui e te tiamana, ko Juliet Tainui Hernandez tuku ingoa he uri o nai tahua hau. I am speaking on behalf of the International Institute for Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Policy. Indigenous peoples have been stewards of our lands, waters, and territories since time immemorial. As the world responds to the interconnected challenges of climate change, rapid technological advances, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, Indigenous peoples' knowledge, leadership, and governance are increasingly needed. Yet our collective rights and responsibilities are under growing pressure. Globally, we have observed uneven implementation of the Declaration, with regression rather than progress in many places, Indigenous participation constrained by systems designed by others, free, prior and informed consent too often treated as procedural rather than substantive, insufficient recognition of the contribution of Indigenous knowledge systems and worldviews, enabling conditions including legislation, funding and resources not equitably available to support Indigenous stewardship, recognition of Indigenous knowledge and rights that is narrow and excludes the right to development, and unjust transition processes undermining our authority to govern our affairs and care for our lands, waters and territories. The rights affirmed in the Declaration are the foundation for resilient environmental governance and intergenerational stewardship. We therefore request that the expert mechanism undertake a study on Indigenous peoples' collective rights in the context of transition and increasing pressure on nature and governance systems. The study should examine both Indigenous-led models of best practice and the structural barriers to the full realisation of rights. It should also develop practical recommendations that strengthen collective rights, recognise Indigenous knowledge and governance systems, decision-making authority and the right to development, and support direct and equitable access to resources as essential to achieving a truly just transition. Mauri ora.
Thank you very much for your statement. Next, I'd like to offer the floor to Images for Inclusion.
Gracias, Madam Chair. Mary Kompu Imun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Garcia from Images for Inclusion. I would like to greet our brothers and sisters present in this room. Our organization would like to respectfully suggest to the subsidiary body that in order to implement the declaration, to carry out a specific study that is focused on two main challenges. First, in line with Articles 40 and 46 of UNDRIP, we request the consideration of practices that can present administrative firewalls that guarantee impartiality and prevent conflicts of interest in the ethical architecture of the United Nations. That is urgent to put an end to the turnstiles, preventing through obligatory vote of 5 years as authorities and state functionaries to participate then as independent experts, advisors, and investigators on the same questions as part of the system. Second, in line with Article 38, we request the consideration of specific situations that happen with states, for example, Chile, when they do not look at principles of self-determination and prior informed and free consent, Articles 3 and 19, in its national legislation. There's been an occupying proliferation of norms of a lesser force as resolutions that regulate the consultations with indigenous peoples. Finally, we urge EMRIP to coordinate efforts to guide future recommendations of a technical nature to take into account the conclusions made by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights on the legal framework of Chile, especially Decree 66, 2014. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your statement. Next, we have a joint statement from Indigene Global Confederation India, Adivasi Mahasabha Foundation.
Distinguished Chair, experts, Johar. India abstained from ratifying UNDRIP despite voting in favor with no formal recognition mechanism for Adivasi peoples under international indigenous rights frameworks. On future work and follow-up, we ask the mechanism to move from general studies towards sustained named monitoring of ongoing cases. Under India's PESA Act, the Gram Sabha or the village council consent is legally required before land in scheduled areas is diverted for mining or in industrial use. In Pelma, Raigarh district of Chhattisgarh, the Gram Sabha has voted against a proposed coal mine 4 separate times. Each time the Coal Bearing Areas Act has been invoked to override that consent. In Sijimali, Odisha, a bauxite mining project linked to the Vedanta Group is proceeding despite documented community opposition and unresolved consent disputes. These are not isolated disputes. This is the pattern by which free, prior, and informed consent is violated as it produces an inconvenient result for capital. Environmental destruction is inseparable from the destruction of Adivasi ecology and of Adivasi sovereignty, and the land grabbing in Odisha and Chhattisgarh follows this pattern repeatedly and not as an exception. We ask the mechanism to establish an independent follow-up monitoring on the Pelma and Sijimali cases and to request a formal public response from India on how Gram Sabha vetoes will be honored going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that statement. And next, I'd like to call on Assemblée des Arméniens d'Arménie Occidentale.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Honorable participants, as we move to the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, and the Assembly of Armenians of Western Armenia participated in the process of preparing that document. Now it's time to look at the future work of the mechanism. During the process of national work in line with the right to self-determination, and despite the resistance that we have seen in this meeting, we have already talked about the Turkish plan and then Turkey-Azeri plan, that after the 1894 genocide of Armenians until the ethnic cleansing of 2023, when 150,000 indigenous Armenians of Tarsan that led to 5,000 deaths, have no limits in terms of violence that is banned by Geneva Conventions and international treaties signed by the countries. This violence was condemned by the European Court on Human Rights that has seen the so-called Azeri army run across the forest of Artsakh to pursue two small boys, and that they eventually kill. The violation of the conventions by Turkey and Azerbaijan undermines UN mechanisms and their work. I'd like to recall Azerbaijan abstained during the vote on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. It is high time for the future to create a new body at the legal level in the form of international tribunal for the protection of the rights of indigenous persons. And we would like to put this question on the agenda for the future work of the mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that statement. Next will be Foundation Girim Babazi.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Ms. Mberte, and I take this floor on the behalf of the Burundian Gawazi Foundation that is involved in the protection of the rights of indigenous persons. I'd like to thank the expert mechanism for the quality of the studies, for technical assistance. That is a very important tool for the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. We nevertheless note the big gap that exists between the recommendations that are made at the international level and the implementation recommendations at the national level. This is the situation in Burundi, where these recommendations remain only in theory. Would like to ask the mechanisms to ensure that these recommendations are indeed implemented, and we propose the establishment of a voluntary mechanism for follow-up to monitor the measures that are taken in close cooperation with representatives of indigenous peoples, national human rights institutions, and UN teams that are present in countries. We also encourage the mechanism to further carry out technical assistance measures in order to provide assistance to countries in elaboration of national action plans for the implementation of declarations in order to ensure that the objectives are implemented, that resources are provided for effective work. The future work of the mechanism should also give special attention to the protection of the land tenure rights of indigenous peoples and ensure inclusive education and ensure the empowerment of women and indigenous girls, and also to provide additional opportunities and work on risks related to new technologies and artificial intelligence. For us in Burundi, the implementation of the recommendations can guarantee the sustainable access to land, justice.
Apologies, time has elapsed. I'd next like to offer the floor to structural analysis of cultural systems.
Madam Chair, distinguished members of the expert mechanism, while the crucial intersection of indigenous rights and extractive industries has historically received limited dedicated focus, the rapidly changing global landscape requires our collective attention. Today, the modern global economy imposes structural pressures so profound that they penetrate the very fabric of local communities. As documented recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the overwhelming presence of external mining models has created a highly complex situation. Facing severe economic pressures, some local communities have been drawn into adopting these very same unsustainable extraction methods to survive, supplying global markets and inadvertently impacting their own ecosystems heavily. This tragic shift in collective agency does not diminish indigenous values per se. Rather, it underscores the systemic nature of the challenge where external economic realities heavily constrain local autonomy and test traditional resilience. Therefore, we respectfully suggest that EMRIP undertake a thematic study on the impacts of transition mineral extraction on indigenous autonomy and self-determination. Such a study would support the Human Rights Council, member states, and indigenous peoples in advancing the implementation of UNDRIP. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that statement. Next is a joint statement from the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, the National Indian Health Board, Azul Network, Akal e Hajab.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair. We thank you for the discussion on EMRIP's future work and for the opportunity to identify areas where the mechanism can continue to strengthen the implementation of UNDRIP. Throughout this session, we have heard the importance of strengthening implementation, cooperation across United Nations mechanisms, and practical guidance for member states. We respectfully suggest that these present an opportunity for a complementary future thematic report by EMRIP. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has progressively developed the Indigenous Determinants of Health framework, demonstrating how policy coherence across institutions directly affects the realisation of our Indigenous rights. Building on this framework and drawing on its human rights mandate, EMRIP could consider a future thematic report examining how policy coherence can advance this. This study could examine how issues such as self-determination, FPIC, meaningful and enhanced participation, institutional accountability, governance and financing collectively influence the realisation of our rights, with a goal to identify ongoing recommendations for member states. The framework is grounded in UNDRIP and informed by international standards and instruments, enabling EMRIP to build on an established body of Indigenous-led work while fully respecting the distinct mandates of both mechanisms. A complementary report would not duplicate the work of UMFI, but would extend it through EMRIP's unique mandate, providing practical human rights guidance while demonstrating how complementary work by both bodies can strengthen policy coherence across the whole United Nations system. Mauri ora.
Thank you very much for your statement. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Crimean Tatar Resource Center.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Iskender Bariyev. I represent the indigenous Crimean Tatar people and their representative body. For EMRIP's future work, I recommend to examine the impact of interstate conflict on the development of indigenous peoples, conduct a study on the implementation of the declaration in the national laws of various countries, conduct a global study on indigenous participation in peace building, conduct research into the use of land by indigenous peoples in the context of interstate military conflict in occupied territories in the disposition of their territory, conduct research on the right to self-determination of indigenous people in the context of interstate conflict in occupied territory, employ the possibility of EMRIP providing expert assistance to indigenous peoples in organizing human rights activities. An important function of the EMRIP should be expert assessment of national legislation on indigenous peoples issues. Explore the mechanism that strengthen the self-government, democratic governance, and representative capacity of indigenous peoples in accordance with their own tradition and institution. Conduct a study on overcoming the consequences of genocide and other international crimes against indigenous peoples committed in 20th and 21st centuries, including the issues of state deliberate evasion of compensation and restitution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your statement. Next, I'd like to call on Indigenous Peoples Forum, Nepal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Asia Indigenous Caucus acknowledge the importance of EMRIP org studies and mandates. We also appreciate the recent studies on the rights of indigenous peoples in conflict and post-conflict situation, which has provided an opportunity on how states participating in and understanding this study is critically important for several structures, legal and security reasons. Asia is home to 2/3 of the world's indigenous peoples, about 350 million of indigenous peoples. Still, we remain challenged. The states that still continue to reject our inherent rights to the oppression of our self-determination, the excessive development and use of artificial intelligence, alarming that governments, academics, and business enterprises are creating disease from our indigenous knowledge and languages and making them accessible for artificial intelligence use. Therefore, we call upon to the expert members revisit our last year recommendation to conduct dialogues and studies with the indigenous peoples and member states in Asia to achieve recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples as the principle of UNDRIP, and to argue member states to comply with the UNDRIP and act in accordance with international laws. To conduct comprehensive study assessing the cumulative impacts of green energy extraction and mass plantation expression on indigenous lands, specifically evaluating the distinct health and socioeconomic vulnerability of the indigenous women and persons with disabilities. To prepare the thematic report followed by the dedicated
Sorry to
panel.
interrupt. Time has elapsed, unfortunately. I'd next like to give the floor to National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium.
Yama Durong. Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Sadie from the Wiradjuri Nation of Australia, and I represent the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium. I recognise and pay respect to elders and ancestors from all Indigenous peoples here today. Indigenous knowledges, our oral traditions and cultural practices embody the deep time and life ways of us as Indigenous peoples and the customs, belief and wisdom of our elders. Our orality, our oral traditions have maintained our connections to ancestors and cultural lore. Present-day knowledge systems are interwoven with ways of being that have been handed down to us intergenerationally since time immemorial. However, since the first visitor to our lands picked up a pen, our knowledges have been taken from our peoples through unethical research and knowledge extractive practices. We acknowledge the good work of EMRIP on data sovereignty and the WIPO Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources and Associated Traditional Knowledge, and we join the call from the National Council of American Indians and the Native American Rights Fund, seeking EMRIP to urge nation states to commit to the treaty. We also seek EMRIP to continue to prioritise the work on the protection of Indigenous peoples' knowledges through collaboration with other United Nations Indigenous mechanisms and through robust focus and study on the extraction and needed international protection of all forms of Indigenous peoples' knowledges. Our knowledges are not only tangible, but intangible. Our ways of being, our shared orality, have been gifted to us by our creators and are not for others to claim, record, or misappropriate. Articles 11, 12, 13, 31 confirm our rights to protect our knowledges and share in a way that we define. This must be upheld. Nothing about us without us. I offer my Yindimara, my deepest honour and respect to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that statement. I'd next like to offer the floor to Conseil de la Nation Atikamekw.
Kwe Kasina, je m'appelle.
My name is Christina Kataliv. I am a fellow of the OHCR Fellowship Program. As the mechanism continues its work for the promotion and implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, it is crucial that the priorities respond to the priorities and challenges that our communities face. One of these challenges, it is the energy transition. The development of renewable energies is crucial to combat climate change and to implement the rights of Indigenous peoples. In our territories, we are facing serious situations related to development, and this leads to also undermining the movement of migratory birds. We have to use our knowledge and our identity in the future work. The expert mechanism can play a determining role in preparing practical guidelines related to implementation of prior informed and free consent under Article 32 of the Convention, and it also can develop best practices related to energy transition, the protection of biodiversity, and respect of the rights of Indigenous persons. We encourage the mechanism to continue its work by placing territorial rights and Indigenous governance and free, prior, and informed consent at the heart of the studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that statement. Next, I'd like to offer the floor to Parbatya Chattogram Jana Samhati Samiti.
Honorable Chair, thank you for the floor. 29 years ago, Bangladesh and the Juma people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts signed a peace accord. It promised demilitarization, self-governance, land returned. 29 years later, they are still waiting. This year, the waiting got worse. Instead of withdrawing troops, the government approved 34 new border guard Bangladesh outposts. Over 400 temporary camps still stand, some for 2 decades. The region is run not by its own hill councils, but by a military order called Operation Uttaran, Upliftment, for a policy that has delivered only occupation. Land grabs, attacks, forced conversions, violence against women and girls follow wherever implementation stalls. This mechanism does not need another description of what is wrong. It needs to act on what it already knows. First, the call for an international mechanism to resolve treaty and accord disputes, with the registry to protect them dates to 1999, reaffirmed by EMRIP in 2022. Whatever form it takes, it has not been delivered effectively to communities like the Juma. I'm not asking for a new framework. I'm asking the mechanism to make the one it owes visible, starting with the CHT Accord. Now, second, Bangladesh is now at the midpoint of its universal periodic review cycle and has the opportunity to submit a midterm report. I ask this council, EMRIP Council, to press Bangladesh to use it to account for CHT Accord implementation, camp withdrawal, the Land Commission, and the Regional and Hill Districts Council. Next year marks 30 years. 30 years is not a delay, it is a choice. The Juma people did not sign an accord to be managed. They signed it to be free. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your statement. Next, I'd like to call on Royal State Tahiti and its islands.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank you for giving me the floor. I speak on behalf of the Royal State of Tahiti and the islands. We praise the work of the expert mechanism, and the studies and opinions of the mechanism have strengthened the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, if we look at future work and a follow-up of previous recommendations, we'd like to make a relevant contribution. Over the years, the mechanism has represented center for very important studies and recommendations. We believe a new stage could focus on having an approach that is focused on specific experiences to better understand how recommendations are implemented and how they impact the lives of Indigenous persons. We invite the mechanism to consider in this work program for 27-28 a study that is related to the living cases of Indigenous governance, the relevant experience, how Indigenous peoples do effectively work through their institutions and carry out their responsibilities. This can enrich any form of follow-up to recommendations and guide future work. In this spirit, we have submitted some example of what we have done. For example, one example is the experience and the methodological contribution to such thinking. We believe that our experience can help future work. As we move towards the 20th anniversary of the Declaration in 27, we do hope that our approach can bring international norms closer to the realities faced by Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the statement. Next, I'd like to call Friends of Lake Turkana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I bring the voices of Indigenous people from Lake Turkana Basin. As the mechanism reviews its future work, I respectfully request the mechanism to give stronger and more practical attention to how energy-related development processes in Kenya are affecting Indigenous peoples' livelihoods, lands, waters, resources, and rights to self-determination. In the Lake Turkana Basin, Indigenous peoples and marginalized communities are facing changing lake conditions, prolonged droughts, loss of rangelands, water stress, water and health securities, and weakening traditional livelihood system. These pressures are made worse by development processes, including upstream water infrastructure, the Gibe dams and irrigation schemes in Ethiopia, which affects the natural flow of River Omo. Large-scale wind projects, that is Lake Turkana Wind Power Project and the upcoming Marsabit Wind Power Project, oil exploration activities in the Lokichar Oil Basin, and other renewable energy investments in Kenya, and more extractive interests that are often planned without adequate recognition of Indigenous people's rights, governance systems, and free, prior, and informed consent. We are not saying that development processes and renewable energies is the problem in itself. The problem is when the development is imposed on Indigenous lands and waters without consent, without benefit sharing, without protection of livelihoods, and without accountability for harms caused. We therefore request the mechanisms to consider in its upcoming and future work a dedicated follow-up on climate action, renewable energy, extractives, and Indigenous people's rights in Kenya. This should include practical guidance to states, agencies, investors, and development actors on how to prevent green energy and extractive projects from causing dispossession, conflict, environmental harm, and livelihood losses. We also request EMRIP to strengthen follow-up on free, prior, and informed consent, Indigenous-led environmental governance, protection of Indigenous
So sorry
knowledge.
to interrupt, but time has elapsed. I'd next like to offer the floor to Wind Sports International.
Good afternoon to all delegations. Madam Chair, given the current liquidity crisis being experienced by the UN agencies, programs, and mechanisms, which is sidelining human rights generally, and specifically Indigenous peoples' human rights and treaty rights, as future work, we call for an in-depth study on the budgetary impact utilizing existing information and reports by and for the UN expert mechanism in collaboration with the UN Third Committee to determine the following: to identify and report the real cause or causes and the reasons for the liquidity crisis at the UN, the annual budgetary impact assessment on the 4 UN mechanisms for Indigenous peoples, the current impact on the UN administration and secretariat on the fulfillment of each of the individual mandates of our UN mechanisms, identifying and reporting the direct human cost borne by Indigenous peoples as a result of reductions to human, financial, and technical resources, which are otherwise deemed essential for all the other UN programs, projects, and agencies. Given the results of the study, what is the projected future long-term budget estimate of the next decade as it relates to the fulfillment of the mandates specific to the rights of Indigenous peoples. The net human, financial, and technical contributions, direct and indirect investments by Indigenous peoples for the UN are substantial. Therefore, the thematic focus of these calls to determine in good faith the human rights-based efficiencies for the implementation, and in compliance of generally accepted financial standards. Given the urgency of the UN liquidity crisis, we suggest an early timeline for this study. In conclusion, Madam Chair, as this will be our only opportunity, I understand this is your last session during your term, and our delegations want to thank you for your outstanding service and dedication to Indigenous peoples' causes globally as a member of the expert mechanism. Ai, merci, nakomik, gracias, pasibo, many thanks. Ai.
Thank you very much for your statement, Chief Littlechild, and thank you for your words. I'm very, very touched. Thank you. Okay. Next, Confederación Indígena Tairona.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the International Forum of Indigenous Peoples on the World Heritage. This is a world platform of Indigenous peoples linked to the UNESCO Convention. This statement follows up on the recommendations of the MEPI on that convention in its study related to cultural heritage and the right to participate in decision-making. Last year, the UNESCO Committee adopted Decision 4711, which requested the UNESCO to work together with Indigenous peoples to improve their participation in the convention and to better reflect their heritage values when enlisting UNESCO cultural sites. This is in line with the outcome document of the International Workshop of Experts on Cultural Heritage and Indigenous Peoples, and this was held in Geneva in 2024. Where the MEPI was represented. Our forum has collaborated with UNESCO on a roadmap to implement this decision, which will be considered at the 48th session of the committee next week in South Korea. We believe that this process is key for the MEPI and responds to various recommendations. We would ask the EMRIP to formally request to UNESCO and request its interest to take part in that decision 4711. Secondly, we welcome the MEPI proposal that the Human Rights Council hold a panel on the recognition of the rights and values of Indigenous peoples in the UNESCO Convention. And we also welcome that this be held during the next session of the Council in September. Our forum is ready to support you in this panel, and we would like MEPI to request the OHCHR to be involved in its planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that statement. Next, I'd like to call on Tu Mau Samoa.
Greetings, Chair and distinguished members of the expert mechanism. My name is Maria Tawailaki. I am an Indigenous Samoan and a 2026 United Nations Indigenous Fellow. I would like to encourage the expert mechanism to consider Indigenous peoples in cross-border contexts as part of its future program of work. Over the years, the expert mechanism has produced important studies that have strengthened implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples across many areas. However, the growing movement of Indigenous peoples across international borders, including through regional labor mobility programs, remain largely absent from this work. A future study could examine how the rights affirmed in Articles 2, 3, 17, and 21 of the Declaration are implemented when Indigenous peoples participate in cross-border labor mobility. And such a study could identify good practices, implementation challenges, and practical recommendations for both sending and receiving states. As labour mobility continues to expand across the Pacific and other regions, I respectfully encourage the expert mechanism to include this emerging issue in its future studies so that the implementation of the declaration reflects the realities faced by Indigenous peoples today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that statement. Next, I'd like to offer the floor to Gambri Kamberi Walgalu Nation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. UNDRIP Paul Girawa House. My name is Paul Girawa House. I'm a Nyambri Kamberi, a Walgalu Wiradjuri man. The name of Australia's capital city, Canberra, comes from the Walgalu language of my people, the Nyambri Kamberi people. And I'm sure I don't need to remind this audience that Australia was one of the 4 Kansas nations that initially voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the UN General Assembly in September 2007. While all 4 countries have since reversed their positions and endorsed the declaration, Australia has still not implemented the declaration in Australian domestic law at the national level. As we all know, the declaration is the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous people. The declaration reflects the needs and aspirations of Indigenous people, and it also addresses the concerns of the nation states in Article 46. The declaration expresses rights and in doing so explains how Indigenous people want nation states and others to conduct themselves in relation to matters that affect Indigenous people's rights and interests. All of the articles in the declaration are legally grounded entitlements that must be applied in full because it is the benchmark for the legal recognition of our rights and our autonomy over our own affairs. In 2023, the Australian Parliament Joint Standing Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs published a record on its inquiry into the application of UNDRIP in Australia. The report made 6 recommendations in implementation to UNDRIP. The committee recommended the Commonwealth Government establish a number of recommendations here. Australia's failure to implement the declaration is a national disgrace within Australia and an international embarrassment. I therefore call on the expert mechanism to report Australia's failure to take necessary steps to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the Human Rights Council urges a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people on his planned visit to Australia later this year to pay particular attention to this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. Next, calling Nama Traditional Leaders Association.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Geneva Sachs and I'm a representative from the Nama Traditional Leaders Association. I thank the Chair and the expert mechanism for the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion. Across Southern Africa, Indigenous people continue to experience the enduring consequences of colonialism, land dispossession, and the 1904 and the 1908 genocide committed against the Nama Indigenous people. In this regard, the Nama Traditional Leaders Association Youth Forum respectfully submits the following recommendations. First, we encourage the expert mechanism to strengthen follow-up to its previous studies and advice by developing more effective mechanisms to monitor implementation and to support member states in translating recommendations into practical action in partnership with Indigenous people. Secondly, we want to request that the EMRIP undertakes a dedicated thematic study on the continuing impact of the 1904 and the 1908 genocide against the Nama people. Such a study should examine the long-term legal, social, economic, cultural, environmental, and intergenerational consequences of this genocide. Thirdly, we would like to respectfully encourage the Special Rapporteur during the future visit to examine the human rights implications of Namibia's green economy agenda, particularly large-scale renewable energy developments proposed on indigenous ancestral lands. In this regard, we draw attention to the large-scale renewable energy and green hydrogen development, which is proposed within the ancestral territories of the Nama people in southern Namibia. lands in which the Nama communities were dispossessed during the colonial period and the 1904 and the 1908 genocide. We respectfully request that the Special Rapporteur to assess whether the rights of the affected indigenous communities to free, prior and informed consent, meaningful participation through representative institutions and effective remedies are being fully respected. Finally, we'd like to encourage the EMRIP and the Special Rapporteur to continue developing practical guidance on addressing historical injustices affecting Nama people, including land restitution,
I'm
reparative
so
justice.
sorry. Your time has elapsed. I'd next like to offer the floor to Indigenous Peoples' Rights International.
Madam Chairperson, Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, EPRI, welcomes EMRIP's continued attention to the situation of indigenous human rights defenders, including those who have faced reprisals for engaging with the United Nations, and to the growing impact of violence and criminalization against indigenous peoples. As part of our mandate, EPRI has documented widespread human rights violations against indigenous peoples and is currently developing a global database and research on violence and criminalization affecting indigenous communities. One of the most consistent findings emerging from our work is the lack or inadequacy of protection mechanisms for indigenous human rights defenders. In many countries, such mechanisms simply do not exist. Where they do exist, they often fail to reflect indigenous realities. Protection measures are generally designed for individuals rather than communities and frequently overlook the collective nature of indigenous rights, territories, and governance systems. At the same time, indigenous peoples have developed their own collective protection strategies, including indigenous guards, community-based monitoring, and traditional governance systems. These initiatives deserve greater recognition and support together with states' compliance with their obligations to protect human rights defenders. EPRI therefore respectfully requests EMRIP to develop expert advice on protection mechanisms for indigenous human rights defenders, assessing existing indigenous national, regional, and international approaches, identifying good practices and gaps, and providing practical recommendations to strengthen culturally appropriate and collective protection. We also encourage EMRIP to convene an international expert workshop where indigenous defenders can share their experiences, as well as states, national human rights institutions, and international human rights mechanisms. EPRI stands ready to support this process and to contribute to the preparation of a future report and expert advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the statement. Next, I'd like to call Namakon Network of Heritage Advocacy.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Nicodemus Cooper. As EMRIP considers the future program of work, we respectfully encourage the expert mechanism to undertake a study on the long-term impacts of colonialism, genocide, and historical injustices on indigenous people, particularly those whose communities today live across international borders. I speak on behalf of the Nama people of Botswana, descendants of those who fled the genocide committed against the Nama in German Southwest Africa. Forced displacement did not end our suffering. It separated families, fractured communities, accelerated language loss, weakened our cultural institutions, and left generations disconnected from their ancestral lands, while unresolved trauma carries on. On the 16th of March 1908, our people had fled into what is now Botswana. More than 50 Namakwen, led by legendary Cap Simon Cooper, were reportedly killed in what is today Kalahari Transfrontier Park. More than a century later, their human remains have never been recovered or given a dignified burial. For our community, this is not only a historical fact, it remains an open wound. We are encouraged that Botswana government has embraced a stronger human rights approach. We respectfully hope this creates a space for open dialogue on these difficult chapters for our shared history and meaningful engagement. We are equally concerned that the Namibian-German reparation process is approaching the conclusion without meaningful participation of Nama communities living in the diaspora, including those in Botswana, despite being descendants of the displaced by genocide. As UN human rights experts have previously emphasized, meaningful participation of affected communities indispensable to truth, reconciliation, and effective reparations. We therefore respectfully recommend EMRIP to develop a dedicated study dignified treatment of ancestral remains and the full participation of affected communities in reparation process.
Time has elapsed, unfortunately. Next, I'd like to offer the floor to Comunidad Campesina Indígena de Owe. Comunidad Campesina Indígena. How about African Indigenous Foundation for Energy and Sustainable Development?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to contribute to this agenda item. As we consider the future work of the expert mechanism, and as we make preparation to celebrate the 20th anniversary of UNDRIP, the state of implementation of UNDRIP by states remains critical and indeed worrisome. Without implementation, the UNDRIP will make no difference in the lives of ordinary indigenous people on the streets. This recognition of the above that we propose that one, EMRIP should, as part of its future work, consider carrying out a report or study on the national implementation of UNDRIP across countries, sharing good practices, challenges, and failures, which should be presented at the 20th session of EMRIP. This should also include the examination of the role of UN agencies at the national level, especially on the integration of the UNDRIP in the national program and national action plans, particularly with the statewide action plan that was required under the outcome document. Two, following the rush for green energy and a deepened extractive focus on traditional minerals and the inherent human rights abuses that are arisen from Nigeria to Zimbabwe, from Ghana to Namibia, traditional mineral exploitation already generating conflict and great human rights abuse against indigenous peoples. We therefore propose to EMRIP to carry out a study on indigenous peoples, energy sovereignty, and traditional minerals, particularly with the human rights situation that we're seeing around traditional mineral exploitation in Africa. But until for effective participation, there is absolute need for fairness in the conduct of the affairs of indigenous-led organizations. For Africa, we are worried
Statement. Next, I'd like to call on Alianza de Pueblos Originarios de Borique Organización CAN.
Taiwan, Bomatum, gracias.
Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the expert mechanism. I'm from Puerto Rico, an Borique ancestral land. I am Barbara, and I'm a member of an organization, and I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Alliance of Peoples coming from the Caribbean and Puerto Rico. We would like to say that there's an alarming lack of guarantees in the field of human rights that our Indigenous people suffers as a direct consequence of our colonial status. In our territories, there is a tax power which is in force through the US government, through a board that has been imposed externally. This means that we have payments to Wall Street being prioritized, and there's a structural dismantling of our living conditions. This colonial and humanitarian crisis has been strictly documented by the special procedures of the UN. We would mention the report of the special procedure on human rights in 2018, and also communications of the special rapporteurship on the right to health in General Assembly. In its subsidiary body, the Special Committee on Decolonization, which has adopted over 40 historic decisions on the issue of Puerto Rico to demand the end of the colonialism and demand receive information from peoples affected and to conduct a study together with the Decolonization Committee on Indigenous peoples in non-autonomous territories with a colonial status, so as to achieve the goals. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for that statement. Next is Sandhill Band of Lenape and Cherokee Indians.
To help us learn how to retrieve and rescue ceremonial objects, ancestral remains, manuscripts, cultural patrimony, and traditional knowledge, according to the Articles 11, 12, and 31 of the Declaration. Deserving the same respect, protection, and revitalization and transmission afforded to indigenous languages, oral traditions, and ceremonial practices. Their return is essential not only for cultural preservation, but also for the continuity of indigenous spiritual science, mechanism to continue strengthening its role in monitoring the treatment of indigenous children and families and vulnerable indigenous communities through country engagements and observation wherever it is requested by indigenous people. We recommend also for EMRIP to do country visits, especially in the state of Hidalgo, Mexico, to help family farmers learn how to protect the rivers and their waters. Thank you very much.
Work. And let me be candid. This mechanism's mandate is to assist states in achieving the ends of the declaration through studies, good practices, and advice, with its success measured by states' actions. The declaration and political unity of sovereign states be respected. This was fundamental condition of the declaration on which many states, including Indonesia, voted in favor in 2007. Including calls for independence from a sovereign state. This is concerning and must not be allowed. When the declaration's own terms are ignored, the result is not stronger rights, it is weaker